clearly one new area within this national risk assessment that wasn't catered for before, is the targeted financial sanctions and the proliferation of finance. So these didn't feature before in our national risk assessment, but this national risk assessment has a shortish section dealing with it.
What's important to note before we go into more detail here is that there's a table, table 101 on page 194, which is analyzing the terrorist financing risks. And when you read it, you realize that not all sectors are mentioned in that table. What this means is that if the sector is not mentioned in that table, then it's being assumed that the terrorist financing risk is insignificant in that particular sector, right? So if land-based gaming is not mentioned in that particular sector, then it means that terrorist financing risk is,
at least that is our understanding. Our understanding, even after having spoken to the authorities, is that they included a comprehensive list of areas that are likely to increase the level of terrorism financing risk. So the corollary to that is if a service you provide is not over there, then you can omit it when looking at terrorism financing.
In this sector, there's a lot that can be said. Obviously, we're not going to be going through every single point, but the main threats that were highlighted from a terrorist financing perspective, I would say, are twofold. So first, there is the movement of funds through the involvement of Maltese registered companies. However, the document highlights that no transfers have actually occurred through Malta. So that was the highest threat level that was assigned. And then there's also the movement of funds for terrorist financing purposes via financial intermediaries. But and then the text goes into more detail, the narrative, and explains that these financial intermediaries are money remitters. Okay, so it's not in general all financial institutions, but it is more focused on remitters. There are some very interesting statistics as well throughout the document, which says that basically the number of high-risk jurisdictions to which there were transfers to and from, high risk in terms of terrorist financing, okay, we're referring to now, the number of these countries have actually decreased over the years. Okay, so they've identified 7 main countries where transfers have actually been made or received from through Malta, and these countries are mainly Central, West and East Africa. They've also identified that the majority of transfers to and from such jurisdictions were done mainly through remitters, and very few were actually done through banks. On the other hand, they've also identified transfers to voluntary organizations as obviously being higher risk from a TF perspective, particularly if these are linked to higher risk jurisdictions from a TF perspective. And they realized that when it comes to transfers to and from voluntary organizations, these were done mainly via credit institutions as opposed through financial institutions and money remitters. The document talks a lot about different types of threats that there are, but in a nutshell, these are the main ones. We can also add cryptocurrencies as being having a high threat level from a terrorist financing perspective, and also trade-based terrorist financing. But in a nutshell, those are what were highlighted as being the main threats when it comes to terrorist financing. Then the NRA also looks at the vulnerabilities from a terrorist financing perspective. And again, the vulnerabilities appear to be the highest in financial remitters. And one vulnerability that was mentioned was the lack of effective controls when it comes to terrorist financing risk, particularly in the financial sector when it comes to money remittance. So this was something that was highlighted throughout the document. And there's also mention throughout the document, but especially in the terrorist financing sector, the fact that many legal persons registered in Malta do not have a bank account, or at least do not appear to bank with Maltese. And in Malta, basically, they don't have a Maltese IBAN. And they've actually identified that out of all these companies, only 22% who have BOs that are nationals of a high-risk jurisdiction from a TF perspective have a Maltese IBAN. So all the rest, which is quite a significant number, do not have a Maltese IBAN. And this is something that they are, attributing to the terrorist financing risk in Malta.
So it seems that rather than the raising of funds, it's the moving of funds that is an issue in Malta. So the focus from a terrorism financing point of view needs to be much more on the movement of funds. At least that's my understanding, that's my reading of the document.
Yes, for sure. And then they also go into what are the effectiveness of the controls from the authorities' side. Let's say the effectiveness of the mitigating measures is considered to be high, and there is obviously a lot of detail as to why and what measures have been put into place. And then when it comes to the actual subject persons, the rating of effectiveness of controls is lower. It's actually rated as substantial, so it's basically at a medium level. And there is also some indication in the text that says that more needs to be done in terms of implementing more effective controls from a terrorist financing perspective, specifically in the remittance sector. And overall, the residual risk has been rated as medium.
What's also interesting from a terrorism financing point of view is that there's a difference. The document makes a differentiation between those voluntary organizations that fall within the FATF scope and those that don't fall within the FATF scope, which is a difference that we don't have under our law. But for this exercise, they examined only, because those are the interesting voluntary organizations from a terrorism financing risk perspective, as certain categories of voluntary organizations, which I think is an important signal for financial institutions, particularly that serve as voluntary organizations. So it's not all voluntary organizations that need to be treated as high risk from terrorism financing point of view. And this is important from a financial inclusion point of view, because we know that various voluntary organizations which had good causes, that raised funds for very good causes and sent funds to war-stricken areas, to third world countries, etc., we're finding difficulty in being able to carry out such transactions, and therefore one needs to today differentiate between the higher risk terrorism financing, higher risk for terrorism financing voluntary organizations and those that don't fall within that sector. So definitely those that have a domestic presence only, I don't know, clubs and hobby-oriented type of voluntary organizations would definitely fall out of scope. So we invite the various subject persons to be selective when they come to determine which entities require higher risk categorization.
So now I think we can have a look at the proliferation, financing, and targeted financial sanctions risks. These are grouped together in the document. The main threats that were identified refer to the money transfer services used to conduct transfers relating to the procurement of goods, and also the use of trade finance products and services in procurement of proliferation-sensitive goods. Then there are others that are mentioned, for example, the use of vessels and shipping companies, and even the aviation industry in the movement of sensitive goods, or to evade sanctions. And then they mention also the use of front companies with opaque ownership structures to obtain trade finance products and services as parties to clean payments. The risk of proliferation finance was rated as being at a medium level. And in fact, the document says that there haven't really ever been cases of, or they don't know of any cases where proliferation finance was actually identified in Malta. They do mention some important facts and statistics in relation to foreign workers, because obviously we do have a lot of foreign workers in Malta who may be from or have links to sanctioned countries. They also mention Malta's proximity to sanctioned countries, of course, and this could be Malta could be a transshipment hub, and obviously increases the risk of illicit traffic of goods for PF purposes. And they also mention our free port, where they say that basically a huge number of containers are passed to our free port on a daily basis, and they make a distinction between where these containers are originating from. And one important point they make is that the majority of them are from non-EU countries, and the percentage of containers coming from non-EU countries is actually much higher than the ones coming from EU. It doesn't actually go into detail which are these non-EU countries. However, it was highlighted as one of sort of the vulnerabilities as well that there is in the country. And they also mention another vulnerability being the use of cash couriers. And they mention that a large amount of cash is actually declared at the border. And they have the figures that they mentioned were quite pretty high. Outgoing was 75 million and incoming was 27.7 million, which is particularly high. Then if we have a look at table 103, which is the rating of the vulnerabilities, you will see that the main one, the highest one that is rated, is the international nature of the financial transactions behind transshipment trade passing through Malta. And then the second highest would be Malta's geographical proximity to sanctioned countries. So in essence, these are the main risks that were identified, and I think they're pretty straightforward in the sense that we're all in an agreement with them.
So from a subject person point of view, I would say that the areas that would be mostly interested are banks involved in trade finance, I would say, over here, and those professionals who are involved in drawing up certain documents for the trade finance to take place. But other types of subject persons have very little involvement in this area, especially if we speak about transshipment of goods, when that very small percentage of goods going through our ports are actually examined in any port, in actual fact. So we're not saying anything particular to Malta, but the truth is that if there are dual use goods, it's very difficult to identify them because you have to go by solely by the documentation that you examine, and there's very little inspections being carried out to actually see what the goods actually are. So the risk is there, clearly, and it comes out from the NRA, but subject persons themselves, I think, have limited visibility and ability to stop this from actually happening. Nonetheless, I think it's an important point to highlight, because the NRA now goes beyond what it used to address before, which was ML and TF, to also focus on these two areas. So we're nearing the end of this episode. Let's have a quick look now at the threats and the predicate offences, which I think is a key aspect of the NRA if somebody wants to understand what to look out for and which areas which are the red zones that one needs to pay particular attention to in terms of offences and Malta-specific risks.
So the NRA goes into the threats which occur in Malta, basically the threats for laundering proceeds of both foreign and domestic proceeds of crime. And a separate assessment has been carried out on the domestic and on the foreign. But what's interesting is that the predicate offences themselves are featured the same in both. The highest predicate offences which feature. So we're talking about drug trafficking, organized crime, fraud, corruption, and tax crime. Those are the top predicate offences which feature in both areas. But there are a few variances in the ratings. So, for example, when we're looking at domestic proceeds, drug trafficking and organized crime are rated as medium high, whereas fraud, corruption, and tax crime are medium. And as regards foreign proceeds, the medium high ones are organized crime, tax crime, and fraud, including cybercrime this time. So, for example, there is an increase in risk when we talk about tax crime and fraud when we're looking at the foreign proceeds. But what I have noticed is that the main reason for this is based on the data and the fact that which predicate offences featured most in, for example, requests for information or MLAs, and also the amounts involved. So if we take a bit of a comparison, let's take drug trafficking. Drug trafficking under domestic, when we're looking at the domestic proceeds, they're rated as medium high, and under foreign they're rated as medium. Now, this is mainly because the drug trafficking featured as the highest attributable predicate offence in STRs, for instance, and it's also the top predicate offence that led to the freezing of assets. On the other hand, when it comes to foreign proceeds of crime, it was noted that not a significant amount is being laundered in Malta. And there's also interesting description of the modus operandi of the drug scene, whereas before, local drug dealers made individual arrangements on a one-to-one basis with foreign suppliers, or even tried to make personal arrangements to smuggle drugs into Malta. Now we're shifting more where the foreign organized crime groups are providing the drugs to the local dealers. So there's a bit of a shift in that. And even the payments. So, for example, payments for the drugs are made in separate payments through the use of couriers, who at times also move the drugs themselves from one country to another. And these couriers then make the payments to the vendor's country of residence, which is not usually in Malta. So maybe that's why there's a difference in rating. If we look at organized crime and drug trafficking, were very much linked, because drug trafficking was one of the main predicate offences linked to organized crime groups. The NRA distinguished between three types of organized crime. Basically, the first one wasn't really taken into consideration, which is people in Malta being the victims of organized crime. But then it focused on organized crime groups overseas using Malta to launder proceeds of crime, or else groups based locally and laundering funds locally. Locally, we can see an increase of foreigners involved in the local organized crime groups, especially in narcotics. However, because of the way they operate, so for example, there wouldn't be traceable means to, so for example, the use of cash. Unfortunately, it's untraceable, or they use third parties. So because of this, there's a limited financial footprint in Malta of how these organized crime groups are operating. Although the document still acknowledges that there is a high likelihood that organized crime is taking place. It's also interesting, especially for subject persons, to see where there could be the possibility of organized crime groups operating. That the document highlights that locally, most of these are laundering their proceeds through real estate, cars and investments, and likewise abroad. So these are the main areas.
So that's the domestic crime scene we're saying, right?
Yes, exactly. On the foreign side, what they have highlighted is that, especially from investigations by the Malta police force, organized crime in the form of smuggling of migrants to Malta, or in the form of facilitating the movements of migrants. So this was one of the points highlighted. And the main crimes, there's a 2021 organized crime risk assessment, and the main crimes identified, here we're talking about foreign proceeds, okay, is drug trafficking, human trafficking in terms of exploitation of low-paid labor, and to a lesser extent, smuggling of illicit goods. There's a list of typologies, and interestingly, we can see the misuse of Maltese bank accounts by foreigners linked to foreign organized crime groups, ownership of gaming companies and credit financial institutions by organized crime groups, misuse of Maltese registered legal persons which don't have an access to Malta, and even the use of loans to justify movement of funds. So these are all typologies which could very much highlight possible organized crime groups operating. Okay, fraud. So for example, fraud, it was rated as medium in the domestic front. So although it was one of the highest attributable predicate offences in STRs, for instance, the values were lower. So that shows gave a lower impact. So that's why it was rated as medium. On the other hand, when you look at fraud from the foreign proceeds aspect, it is one of the highest predicate offences on which assistance was sought in 2020 and 2021 on neutral legal assistance. And cybercrime was also recorded higher numbers in 2020 compared to 2019. And the amounts were relatively high. So, and this was taken from, for example, reports received by the FIAU, also reports that this was one of the key predicate offences. And typologies for this predicate offence mentioned were forged documentation, use of complex corporate structures, transaction activity which is unexplained or not in line with the customer's profile, and card fraud involving the use of remote gaming accounts. So, and I believe tax crime is one of the ones we haven't talked about. Again, tax crime domestically is rated as medium, whereas for foreign, it's rated as medium high. The local scene is again attributable to the lower value of proceeds of crime, which from data gathered. So although there is the laundering of proceeds of this predicate offence in Malta, the values are lower than those of, for example, foreign tax crimes.
If I come back in at this stage, I think there's a link also to the part on immovable property here. Because there's quite a bit of emphasis in the part on immovable property on the fact that the potential proceeds of crime going into immovable property is mainly domestic. I think there's quite an effort in the document to point out that the purchase of immovable property in Malta is nearly exclusively purchased by Malta residents, and there is very little foreign investment in Maltese properties. I found it a bit strange, but it seems that the empirical evidence that there is out there in terms of property purchase deals links mainly to local investments rather than foreign investment.
Yes, in fact, when you see the immovable property section on its own, that's the feel of it. I think here it may be a bit look different because they're doing a comparison of the predicate offences, and so they're seeing where the higher amounts are. So, for example, for foreign tax crime, although it didn't feature high numbers in MLAs, police-to-police requests, even exchange of information requests from the MTCA, the actual figures were quite substantial compared to other predicate offences. So maybe that's why we're seeing a bit of a difference. And the use of cash-based businesses is also a common typology for tax crime, something to keep because of VAT fraud and
linking this also to Alex's question earlier on risk appetite. I see this common thread throughout the NRA that there's quite a focus on the Maltese grey economy and less of a focus than in the previous NRA on international flows of funds. I think the previous NRA focused quite a bit on the fact that Malta is an international financial centre. This NRA also focuses on immovable property. There's a whole section on immovable property, on the residency by investment, which is a domestic phenomenon to some extent, even though obviously the purchases of the investors in the passport scheme are mainly foreigners. But ultimately, even in the presentations by the NCC, there's quite an emphasis on the fact that the funds, even if there is laundering through these schemes, the laundering is taking place overseas and not in Malta. The BO concealment, there's quite an emphasis in the document on the fact that there is very little evidence of BO concealment through Maltese companies, which I think is fruit of the developments from 2018 to where we are at today with a new register for beneficial owners, more than one register of beneficial owners, etc. So thank you for that. I think it's extremely valuable.
In fact, on this as well, like for corruption, for instance, the rating was affected by the fact that the laundering of the proceeds is generally laundered outside of Malta. So still they acknowledge the likelihood.
And the rating is medium, right, for corruption?
So again, what they're seeing is that the actual, although it might be happening and it is acknowledged, the laundering of the proceeds is more likely to be happening outside of Malta.
Which one would expect in a scenario where you have corruption. Ultimately, people don't like to launder the proceeds of their crime in the same jurisdiction, which is the reason why we used to deal with foreign PEPs as higher risk than domestic PEPs in the past.
The document in the ML threat section also goes into typologies, and there are various listed there. So I encourage subject persons to look at those. I mean, there's mention of use of cash, abuse of complex corporate structures, commingling of funds, and they also distinguish between when there's a domestic involvement or not. So now, when we look at the vulnerabilities, it is interesting to see. There are some of them which we would expect. So, for example, vulnerabilities in the judicial system. And also in the constitutional framework, in the judicial review of sanctions. But, for example, there's de-risking mentioned as well as being a high vulnerability. In other areas, some may see it as effectiveness.
De-risking used to be seen as an effective measure, but the unintended consequences of de-risking, I think, is being highlighted as a vulnerability.
Unfortunately, in the text, there isn't much explained, but in the footnote, there's reference to the banking sector section, so where the risking is mentioned, and the one of voluntary organizations as well.
So I assume we'll be going into more detail on this when we're dealing with banks and financial institutions.
Yes. For effectiveness, the sectoral working groups were looked at to see who has the most effective measures. And then if we look at table 96, which is the residual risk by predicate offense, we see again how they're split and where the main risks lie. Again, they're medium, high, medium, so a reflection of what I've been saying in the beginning. And then there's also on table 97, the residual risk ratings by typology. And I think this one is interesting because we can see, if we look at the inherent risk, the two main ones which are highlighted are the abuse of the Maltese registered legal persons with no links to Malta, which we've been seeing in the document, or the concealment of BO, and also the use of cash and cash-based businesses.
So that's, I think, a very apt way to conclude this first episode. So going through the threats in terms of what are the offences, what are the areas that really expose the jurisdiction to risk, and what we need to look out for, or what subject persons need to look out for. So before concluding and saying see you next time, I think there's, you mentioned table 96. I think there's an important point I wanted to make about a table later on, which is table 106, which is the summary table at the end of the document. And it's a bit of a word of warning for the people reading the NRA, because we got a bit confused ourselves as well. So there's a summary table at the end that can be a bit deceiving, because when you look at the total inherent risk, and then you look at the effectiveness of measures, and you look at the residual risk, the scores being assigned do not tally with the matrix, the heat map that is being used to quantify residual risk. The reason being, because we queried this, that residual risk are averaged, the effectiveness ratings are also averaged, and therefore when you see the two together, you don't necessarily get the result in the third column. So I said this is a word of warning because I've spoken to many people who have only looked at that table and they got totally confused. So ultimately, the table on page 18 is a correct summary, and the table at the very end is simply there for illustrative purposes. So don't rely on that table. So I just wanted to mention that before we conclude this episode. So ultimately, we have gone through quite a bit this morning. I think we've covered at a high level quite a bit in terms of what the NRA says and what we are meant to do with that NRA. And now we look forward to a few more episodes which are more deep dives into the specific sectors. So see you next time, and thank you everybody for your contribution to this. Thank you for following this episode of our NRA 2023 series. We're very happy to continue to interact with you going forward. So if you do have any questions, please send them to us by email so that we can tackle them in the forthcoming episodes.